Documentation, please.
Here, enjoy.
Smart ass. ID check BH847. I see. Thanks. You must think you're something special, eh? Get the hell out of here.
Before we start, I want to clarify something. This is a narrative-heavy game, so the footage in the background of this video will be from the first hour or so of game. Anyway, that being said, the history of Deus Ex Mankind Divided can trace itself back through an acclaimed predecessor in Human Revolution, a derided predecessor in Invisible War, and perhaps one of the most highly regarded video games of all time, Deus Ex. Further back from that, it reaches into the dark, beating heart of role-playing games, with deep roots in titles like the perennially lauded System Shock 2. This history is important in understanding why the game felt free to try and deal with a subject matter as complex and divisive as racism. Racism, along with the many other isms and phobias, sexism, elitism, homophobia, transphobia, you get the drill, seems like a topic that flows naturally from the transhumanist themes of the series. After all, it seems inevitable that a society that embraces a change in your very being, such as mechanical augmentation, would run into many of the same issues that our society faces when people don't fit into established societal norms, or who suffer from established societal prejudice. This theme of a quote-unquote mechanical apartheid was frequently referenced in the promotional marketing material, along with a much derided image that appeared to riff on the Black Lives Matter movement with a picture depicting an All Lives Matter poster. Somewhat inevitably, this sparked a backlash against, at the very least, the use of the word apartheid, but it is worth examining whether this aspect of the game exists simply to be provocative and drum up interest, or whether the game is trying to actually tackle a difficult subject. In my research for this video, I came across a piece that described the problem faced by games that deal with racism. The author suggests that by ignoring racism as it currently exists in our society, i.e. along a primarily and grossly oversimplified for this video black-white axis, and simply relegating it to something that occurs between some form of baseline human and some other, whether that other be elves, aliens, or cyborgs, it devalues the ideals being explored. It also criticised games for rarely putting the player in the position of the discriminated against party, and instead relying on some innate sense of goodness for the player to realise that the awfulness around was vaguely analogous to modern ills. There is merit to these arguments, and they do throw up some interesting perspectives on how Mankind Divided presents the problem. Now, it's worth noting that Deus Ex sidesteps at least one of these complaints, namely the idea that you don't play as a member of the oppressed minority, whilst avoiding the second almost completely by setting the game in Prague, a city that is predominantly white. In fact, thinking through my experience of the game, I think I'm safe in saying that there are very few major non-white characters that aren't also augmented. The experience of Adam Jensen, your proxy into this world, is a peculiar one, and seems to well illustrate the issue of writing about a subject as difficult as oppression, whether that be racism, which is a theme that many people seem to associate with this game, or some other characteristic, because this is still a game that relies on a power fantasy to keep players engaged. Few people play a mainstream AAA title to feel disenfranchised, and the writers go to some trouble to make the game feel like you are constantly being watched, judged, and hated by many of the NPCs, but stop short of actually allowing this to make you feel continually disempowered. Often repeated derogatory comments, and a particularly obnoxious sequence whenever you ride the train in the wrong car, aren't going to give you much insight several hours in. In a vacuum, therefore, I'd suggest that there was at least an attempt on the part of the game writers and developers to include stuff that is at least pretending to deal with an issue as difficult as apartheid or Jim Crow laws. It's also worth mentioning that, as I noted at the start of this video, the theme of oppression and bigotry does flow naturally on from the transhumanist themes of the series. In Invisible War, the oft-reviled sequel to the original Deus Ex, there were two factions who existed on the extremes of society, the Templar and the Omar. The Templar were completely against augmentation of any sort. In fact, they were so opposed that the introduction had them use a suicide bomber to eradicate the main base of a pro-augmentation group. The Omar were the opposite. They were a form of extremely augmented human who were almost so far removed from humanity that they could barely be classified as such. Siding with them at the end of the game involved destroying all the other factions and leaving these extremely modified characters as sole remnants of humanity. These two factions, the Templar in particular, play a huge role in the story told by Invisible War, but rarely does the player get impeded by either, other than as a result of choosing to have them as enemies. Mankind Divided, on the other hand, presents bigotry as being a thing to which all men are prone, not a thing relegated to the extremes of society. Police officers, who are generally decent guys, don't trust you because of your augmentations. Passers-by mutter denigrating words under their breath. Many openly express the thought that any augmented individual is better off apart, an idea that is a hair's breadth away from equal but different. Even the UN is being manipulated into passing legislation that allows for segregation of the augmented. The sum of these parts indicates to me that the writers wanted to contribute to the conversation about social injustice in a meaningful way. Social injustice in this game, however, does not speak directly to the experience of many underprivileged groups in modern society. Whilst terms like mechanical apartheid make for great soundbites, they don't really convey some of the complexity that Mankind Divided is attempting to unpack. In interviews, many of the game's leading developers and writers expressed the idea that they wanted the player to be able to decide for themselves whether what was happening was unjust. The story of the game makes it very clear that augmentation was directly responsible for an incident. The incident referred to occurred late in the previous game when, essentially, a switch was flipped, causing all people with mechanical augmentations to turn into murderous psychopaths for a short while. The game seems, therefore, to be presenting us with a classic moral dilemma. If you don't know whether the person next to you will turn into a murderous maniac, then how would you deal with them? It's here that much of the game's analogy to current forms of social oppression breaks down. As far as I'm aware, there have never been any incidents where a person's sexual orientation, the colour of their skin, or their gender have ever caused them to spontaneously go haywire and start killing. There have certainly been no instances where everyone showing that characteristic loses all at once. There is also the small issue of augmented terrorism. Without wanting to go in depth on this subject, at least not so soon after the game has been released, for fear of ruining large portions of the game for players, it is worth noting that many augmented individuals are portrayed as being, at the very least, sympathetic to terrorists who are purporting to act in their name. In this, we can see analogies to modern conflicts, particularly those that take place in the Middle East, and a distinct line is drawn to the us and them narrative that pervades modern media. The twin pillars of justifiable concern around this Aug incident and much of the augmented population's seeming support, or at least ambivalence towards terrorism, creates a certain justification for the actions and fears of the non-augmented natural portion of the population. Whereas it is almost certainly not the case that developers would want a player agreeing with what the natural population are doing if they are motivated by some simple racism. In the context presented by the game, there exists the possibility for the player to sympathise with oppressive measures and thinly veiled, if at all veiled, prejudice felt by the ordinary citizens of this world. The commentary on racism and the apartheid Jim Crow mould is therefore replaced with a more difficult commentary on Islamophobia in modern society. Unfortunately, none of this even begins to deal with the fact that augmentation was, for the most part, a free choice. Given that for some it seems to have been a free choice, for others it was a choice made under duress, and for yet more it was not a choice at all, it seems clear that the game is making a commentary on current social conflicts, rather than harkening back to the old, but by no means ended, black against white racism. So, where does this leave us? This appears to leave the marketing machine of the game in a bit of an odd spot. It's easy to see why they would shy away from portraying this game as being in some way a representation of what society might become were we to succumb to our baser fears concerning Islam. That's just asking for major trouble, but equally they weren't right to portray this as an examination of more traditional social issues. Perhaps we can conclude that the team looked at the world, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, and opted to use the zeitgeist to their advantage. Oddly, I wonder whether this was a mistake. Making commentary on a much more modern, albeit equally current issue might actually have been a bolder move for the game. The game is set only a decade or so from now, and it is easier to see how the tools that are ostensibly being deployed to combat Islamic extremism could be co-opted to deal with a new threat. The racism that developed over the course of the past few hundred years is based upon something immutable in people, the colour of their skin, their gender, their sexual orientation, but now we can see prejudice existing because of a choice, however free that choice was, that they made. Mankind Divided could have attempted to cast the discussion in that light. It could have shown the pressure that comes with wanting to sympathise with the terrorists, with wanting to fight because you are oppressed for something that is only partially your fault, but tragically the trappings of the plot make this impossible. Knowing that because this is a Deus Ex game there will be some involvement by shadowy, manipulative and powerful organisations somewhat undermines our ability to exercise a valid moral judgment on the actions of the characters in this game, because those actions are the result of another's interference. After all, is it right to judge somebody whose prejudice has deliberately been drummed up by another? In conclusion, therefore, I think that whilst the game does show itself to have merit and does warrant a place at the table when it comes to discussing representation of prejudice in games, it's just worth noting that, as with so many AAA titles, this game has to give in to the need for the audience to find it engaging and fun to play.